Every single year, NFL fans gather around their TVs, their phones, their laptops, hearts pounding, mock drafts memorized, confident they know exactly what's about to happen. And then, the NFL breaks them. Completely, utterly, destroys every prediction, every expert opinion, every piece of conventional wisdom, and leaves millions of people staring at their screens with their jaws on the floor, asking the same three words over and over again. How did this happen? We're talking about the moments that made grown men throw their remotes across the room. The picks that had radio hosts screaming. The slides that turned future Hall of Famers into punchlines for teams that passed on them. The reach is so baffling that even the players themselves couldn't believe what was unfolding in real time. Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on the most shocking, most controversial, most unbelievable draft moments in NFL history. And trust me, by the time we're done, you are going to question everything you thought you knew about how this league evaluates talent. If you've never been here before and you love deep dive sports stories that go further than anyone else dares to go, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because we do this every single week and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Now let's get into it, because this story starts long before draft night. It starts in film rooms, in private workouts, in closed-door meetings where the fate of a young man's entire career gets decided by people who may never have played a single down of professional football in their lives. And sometimes, those people get it catastrophically, embarrassingly, historically wrong. Let's go back, way back, to 1998, because if you want to understand the culture of NFL draft mistakes, you have to start at the source, the moment that essentially created the template for every draft disaster that followed. It was a spring evening in New York City, and the entire football world had already decided that there were two quarterbacks in this draft class who were destined for greatness. One of them was Peyton Manning out of Tennessee, polished, cerebral, a football savant who had been groomed for the NFL since he could walk. The other was Ryan Leaf out of Washington State, raw, powerful with an arm that made scouts physically lean forward in their chairs. The Indianapolis Colts held the number 1 pick, and they chose Manning, as expected. The San Diego Chargers were on the clock at number 2, and they took Leaf. In that moment, with those two picks happening in sequence, nobody in that building, not one single analyst, not one single executive, not one single person watching at home, could have predicted just how differently those two careers were about to unfold. Manning, of course, became the gold standard. 2 Super Bowl rings, 5 MVP awards, a first-ballot Hall of Famer who redefined what it meant to play quarterback in a modern NFL. He was everything the scouts said he would be, and then some. Ryan Leaf, on the other hand, became something else entirely. He became a cautionary tale. He became a warning label. He became the ghost story that NFL front offices tell their young scouts when they want to teach them what happens when you project potential over character, over work ethic, over the intangibles that never show up in a combined report. Leaf's rookie season was nothing short of catastrophic. He completed just 45.3% of his passes. He threw 2 touchdowns against 15 interceptions. He publicly called out teammates in the locker room. He got into screaming matches with coaches. He refused to take accountability for anything, blamed everyone around him, and essentially made himself radioactive within one of the most dysfunctional franchises in the league. The Chargers gave him every opportunity to turn around. They were patient, perhaps more patient than they should have been, but by 2000, after just 3 seasons, they cut him loose. He bounced to Dallas, played 3 forgettable games, and then he was gone. Done. Out of the league before his 25th birthday. Manning, of course, became the gold standard. 2 Super Bowl rings, 5 MVP awards, a first-ballot Hall of Famer who redefined what it meant to play quarterback in the modern NFL. He was everything the scouts said he would be, and then some. Ryan Leaf, on the other hand, became something else entirely. He became a cautionary tale. He became a warning label. He became the ghost story that NFL front offices tell their young scouts when they want to teach them what happens when you project potential over character, over work ethic, over the intangibles that never show up in a combined report. Leaf's rookie season was nothing short of catastrophic. He completed just 45.3% of his passes. He threw 2 touchdowns against 15 interceptions. He publicly called out teammates in the locker room. He got into screaming matches with coaches. He refused to take accountability for anything, blamed everyone around him, and essentially made himself radioactive within one of the most dysfunctional franchises in the league. The Chargers gave him every opportunity to turn it around. They were patient, perhaps more patient than they should have been, but by 2000, after just 3 seasons, they cut him loose. He bounced to Dallas, played 3 forgettable games, and then he was gone. Done. Out of the league before his 25th birthday. What made the Ryan Leaf situation so haunting wasn't just the failure on the field. It was everything that came after. The legal troubles, the substance abuse, the years of watching from the outside as the guy taken 1 pick before him became the greatest statistical quarterback in NFL history. There's something deeply human and deeply painful about that kind of proximity to glory, being that close, being evaluated as nearly equivalent, and then watching the gap between you and the other guy expand. The year was 2007. The Oakland Raiders held the 1st overall pick, and they used it on JaMarcus Russell, a quarterback out of LSU with physical gifts so extraordinary that even the most skeptical scouts found themselves getting swept up in the excitement. Russell stood 6 feet 6 inches tall, weighed nearly 260 pounds, and possessed an arm so powerful that he could throw a football 60 yards from his knees in warm-ups. 60 yards from his knees. When you see something like that, when you witness that kind of raw, freakish physical talent, it's almost impossible not to project greatness onto it. The Raiders certainly did. They gave him a contract worth over $60 million, making him the highest-paid player in franchise history at that point, before he had taken a single snap as a professional. The warning signs, in retrospect, were everywhere. Russell had held out of training camp at LSU during his final year. There were whispers from coaches about his work ethic, about his preparation, about whether the fire that drives elite quarterbacks was actually burning inside him. But the Raiders, an organization that was already in a state of institutional dysfunction following Al Davis's increasingly erratic decision-making, chose to see what they wanted to see. They saw the arm. They saw the size. They saw the potential. They did not look hard enough at everything else. Russell's NFL career was a slow-motion disaster. He never mastered the playbook. He struggled with basic footwork and mechanics that professional quarterbacks are expected to have locked down before they ever take a professional snap. He showed up to training camps out of shape, reportedly significantly overweight during what should have been the most critical developmental years of his career. The stories that leaked out of the Raiders facility during those years were the stuff of sports media legend. Reports of unused game film. Reports of practice habits that alarmed even the most patient coaches on the staff. And then the story that became perhaps the most enduring symbol of his failure. The story of the blank DVD. According to multiple reports, someone within the Raiders organization discovered that Russell had been given game film to study and had returned the DVD blank, meaning he had either watched nothing or had replaced it with an empty disc. Russell denied this story, and its details have been disputed over the years, but by that point, it almost didn't matter. The narrative had calcified. The Raiders eventually released him after just 3 seasons, having won a total of 7 games as a starter and throwing 18 touchdowns against 23 interceptions. The greatest arm talent anyone in the building had ever seen wasted. One of the most valuable draft assets in professional sports. The 1st overall pick, essentially flushed away. Oakland would spend the better part of a decade trying to recover from that single decision. But here's what's so fascinating and so frustrating about the history of NFL draft disasters. The league just keeps making the same kinds of mistakes over and over again because the incentives are almost perfectly designed to produce overconfidence. General managers are paid to make bold decisions. Coaches have short windows to prove themselves. Owners want results immediately. And in that environment, every year, teams convince themselves that this time, with this player, with this particular combination of physical gifts and projected upside, this time will be different. Which brings us to 1989, and to a decision so staggering in its historical irony that it almost defies belief when you actually sit down and map out what happened. The Green Bay Packers held the second overall pick in a draft class that would eventually produce 4 Pro Football Hall of Fame players. 4. In one draft, the Packers' choice was Tony Mandarich, an offensive tackle out of Michigan State who had been hyped as the greatest offensive line prospect in the history of college football. Sports Illustrated put him on the cover. Scouts ran out of superlatives. His combined numbers were legitimately otherworldly. He was 6 feet 6 inches and 315 pounds of what appeared, on the surface, to be the most physically imposing offensive lineman anyone had ever evaluated. The 3 players taken immediately after Mandarich: Barry Sanders, Derek Thomas, Deion Sanders. 3 of the most electrifying football players who have ever lived. 3 future Hall of Famers who would go on to redefine their respective positions. The Packers passed on all of them to take a man who would go on to start just 18 games in 3 seasons before being cut. His career derailed by what he later admitted were serious issues with performance-enhancing drugs and alcohol. Mandarich has been remarkably honest about what happened in the years since. He's admitted the steroid use, admitted the mental health struggles, admitted that the person the Packers drafted was essentially a carefully constructed illusion of greatness that he could not maintain once the external support systems were removed. There's something almost tragic about his story in the same way Leaf's is tragic. A young man who genuinely could not live up to the weight of his own hype, who collapsed under pressure that most human beings are simply not equipped to handle. But the pick itself stands as perhaps the single greatest example of draft misevaluation in modern sports history, because the counterfactual is almost impossible to wrap your mind around. What if Green Bay had taken Barry Sanders? What if that franchise, which was already entering a period of irrelevance that would last until Brett Favre arrived, had built its offense around one of the 2 or 3 greatest running backs who has ever played the game? The alternate timeline is dizzying. Now, the draft is full of not just bad picks, but the flip side, the players who slid so far below where they deserved to go that the teams who passed on them spent years regretting it. And no story in the history of the draft captures that particular kind of institutional failure more perfectly than what happened in 2000 in the 6th round, when the New England Patriots selected a quarterback from Michigan with the 199th overall pick. Tom Brady was not supposed to be great. He was not supposed to be anything. He came out of Michigan having lost his starting job to Drew Henson at various points during his college career, a fact that the coaching staff there used as leverage against him, rotating the 2 quarterbacks in ways that Brady found deeply frustrating and demoralizing. His combine was an absolute catastrophe by NFL standards. His 40-yard dash time of 5.28 seconds was among the slowest ever recorded for a quarterback prospect. The shirtless photo from his combine medical evaluation became one of the most mocked images in sports history precisely because it showed someone who did not look like a professional athlete by any conventional measure. The scouts wrote him off. The executives filed him under backup. Maybe 6 quarterbacks were drafted before Brady in that 2000 draft. 6. Not one of them, not a single one of them, had a career that came anywhere close to what Brady went on to accomplish. 7 Super Bowl rings, 15 Pro Bowl selections, 3 league MVP awards, the most wins by a starting quarterback in NFL history. A career so dominant, so sustained, so historically unprecedented that sports historians are still struggling to find the adequate vocabulary to describe it. And all of it was available, sitting right there on the board, for any of the 31 teams that passed on him. For the price of a 6th-round selection. For the price of nothing. The teams who drafted those 6 other quarterbacks before Brady. The Browns with Spurgeon Wynn at number 284, the Broncos with Jarius Jackson, the Lions with Marcus Quinn. Those organizations carry that miss with them in a very specific way. Not because they could have reasonably predicted what Brady would become. They couldn't. Nobody could. But because the story of his fall illustrates something profound about the limits of scouting, about the way NFL evaluation systems are designed to measure the wrong things, about how the most important qualities in a professional quarterback, leadership, competitiveness, football intelligence, the ability to perform under pressure, cannot be weighed on a scale or measured with a stopwatch. Brady himself has spoken about the experience of sitting in his parents' house in California on draft day, watching round after round go by, feeling the humiliation and the doubt accumulate with every pick announcement. He said it was one of the most painful experiences of his life. And then immediately after saying that, he's acknowledged that it may also have been the most motivating because the chip it put on his shoulder never fully went away. Even at the height of his greatness, Brady carried the memory of being pick number 199. He used it. He turned it into fuel. And every time he raised another trophy, every time he walked off another field victorious, there was a room full of scouts somewhere who knew they had seen him and passed. The draft has also produced another category of disaster that is uniquely maddening. The reach, specifically in the quarterback position, that happens when a team with a desperate need convinces itself that a prospect is better than the available evidence suggests. Perhaps no recent example captures this dynamic more perfectly than what the Jacksonville Jaguars did in 2011, when they selected Blaine Gabbert with the 10th overall pick. Before the draft, there was actually legitimate discussion about whether Gabbert could go first overall. First overall. This was a quarterback who would go on to finish his career at the top of the list of quarterbacks with the most losses as starters. A player so ineffective, so incapable of making the basic decisions that NFL quarterbacking requires, that his presence in the starting lineup became essentially a guarantee of defeat. Now, the draft is full of not just bad picks, but the flip side, the players who slid so far below where they deserved to go that the teams who passed on them spent years regretting it. And no story in the history of the draft captures that particular kind of institutional failure more perfectly than what happened. Gabbert went 5-22 as a starter for Jacksonville. He completed just over 50% of his passes. He never threw for more than 20 touchdowns in a season. He was benched, released, shuffled around the league as a backup for years, and eventually became exactly the kind of journeyman that the 10th overall pick is specifically not supposed to produce. The Jaguars, who were a franchise in desperate need of stability at the game's most important position, had taken a massive swing and whiffed spectacularly, and they would spend years dealing with the institutional damage that a bad quarterback pick causes, because everything in the NFL flows from that position. The offense, the coaching culture, fan engagement, ticket sales, free agent attraction, all of it connects back to whether you have a quarterback who can play. But even Gabbert's story pales in comparison to the sheer brazenness of what the New York Jets did in 2008, when they selected Vernon Gholston out of Ohio State with the 6th overall pick. Gholston was a defensive end, now linebacker, who had put up combined numbers that were genuinely historic. He ran a 4.67 40-yard dash at his size. He bench pressed 375 pounds for 37 repetitions. He was, by every measurable physical standard, a freak of nature. The kind of athlete who makes front office people lose their rational minds because they convince themselves that raw physical capability at that level simply has to translate into football greatness. It did not. Gholston played 3 seasons in the NFL and finished his career without a single sack. 0. In 63 career games. The Jets had used a top 10 pick on a defensive player whose entire value proposition was his ability to rush the passer, and he was never able to do it. Not once. Not in a regular season game. Not in a meaningful moment. Not ever. He was out of the league at 25 years old, and the 6th overall pick in that 2007 draft. The asset the Jets had invested in him was simply gone. Wasted. Returned 0 value. What makes the Gholston story so instructive is how cleanly it illustrates the difference between combined performance and football performance. The NFL scouting combine, which has become one of the most elaborate and expensive talent evaluation events in sports, measures things that are genuinely useful: size, speed, strength, athleticism. But it does not measure football instinct. It does not measure the ability to read a blocker's hands and understand what he's telegraphing. It does not measure the feel for the rush that separates elite pass rushers from everyone else. Gholston had the body. He had the raw tools. He simply did not have the football brain, the technical refinement, or the instinctive understanding of his position that would have allowed him to translate those physical gifts into actual production. And the Jets, dazzled by what they saw on the track and in the weight room, made a decision that cost them years of competitive capital. Now, we cannot talk about shocking draft moments without addressing something that happened in the 2021 NFL Draft, a situation that, when viewed in its full context, reveals just how desperate quarterback-needy teams can become and how that desperation fundamentally distorts rational decision-making. In that single draft, for quarterbacks, Zach Wilson, Trey Lance, Justin Fields, and Mac Jones were taken the top 15 picks. For quarterbacks, in the top 15, the collective front office groupthink that drove those decisions, the competitive fear of missing out on a franchise quarterback, the terror of watching another team grab the guy you passed on and having him become a star, all of it contributed to a feeding frenzy that produced almost universally disappointing results. Zach Wilson went second overall to the Jets, a team that had just watched Sam Darnold fail spectacularly for 3 years and apparently decided the solution was another improving young quarterback with serious mechanical question marks. Wilson's tenure in New York was a disaster characterized by erratic performances, a pocket-collapsing inability to process NFL-level defenses, and a locker room relationship with teammates that deteriorated so severely that his own offensive line essentially stopped trusting him. He was eventually traded to the Denver Broncos for a late-round pick, a transaction that underscored just how far his value had fallen from the number 2 overall selection he had been. Which brings us, inevitably, to the story that may be the most discussed, most debated, most emotionally charged draft moment of the modern era. A story that wasn't just about football. A story that became, in real time, a lens through which millions of people argued about race, about privilege, about the NFL's power structures, about the unwritten rules that govern how certain players are evaluated and treated. The story of Shedeur Sanders and what happened to him in the 2025 NFL Draft. To understand the full weight of what unfolded over those 3 days in April 2025, you have to understand who Shedeur Sanders was in the months leading up to the draft. He was the son of Deion Sanders, one of the most iconic athletes in American sports history, a Hall of Famer whose charisma and cultural significance extended far beyond football into music, television, and celebrity. Shedeur had followed his father to Jackson State and then to Colorado, where Deion had taken over a struggling program and immediately transformed it into a national media phenomenon. Shedeur was the on-field engine of that transformation. He set records at Colorado. He posted a 74.1 completion percentage in his final college season, the highest completion percentage in the FBS that year. He was poised, articulate, extremely comfortable in front of cameras, and radiated a kind of quiet confidence that some people read as charisma and others read as arrogance. And perhaps that is the most lasting thing to say about the history of NFL draft falls and controversial picks. They reveal, more than almost anything else in sports, the gap between how this game presents itself and how it actually works. The draft presents itself as a meritocracy, a pure talent evaluation. The best players go into the teams that need them most. But the reality is far messier, far more human, far more susceptible to ego and bias and institutional culture and pure random chance than the league ever wants to admit. Aaron Rodgers sat in that green room in 2005 and watched teams pass on him because they couldn't see what was right in front of them. Tom Brady waited until the 6th round because the conventional tools of scouting were fundamentally inadequate to measure what made him great. JaMarcus Russell went first overall because the people making the decision were captivated by something real, his arm, his size, his presence, but failed to look deeper at everything that matters more. Shedeur Sanders fell to the 5th round for reasons that will be argued about for years, because the truth is probably a complicated mixture of legitimate concerns and illegitimate ones. And in this league, those things are almost impossible to cleanly separate. Every draft is a bet. Every pick is an act of faith. And the history of the NFL's biggest misses is ultimately the history of what happens when that faith is placed carelessly or cowardly, or without the wisdom to know the difference between what can be measured and what cannot. The board doesn't lie, they say in NFL draft rooms. But the people reading it? They do. All the time. And the players who fall, and the players who get reached for. Disclaimer. This video is based on publicly available reports, news articles, sports media coverage, insider accounts, and ongoing developments. Some details, particularly those relating to anonymous sources within the NFL, have been reported by credible outlets but cannot be independently verified. Draft evaluations are inherently subjective, and perspectives on individual players' slides may differ significantly depending on the source. This content is intended for entertainment and informational purposes and does not represent the definitive account of any individual, organization, or event discussed.